The ballroom of Granville House blazed with 100 candles, their light catching on diamond tiaras and golden epaulettes as London's elite twirled across polished marble floors. In a shadowed alcove far from the orchestra, Miss Josephine Kensington pressed her back against cool wallpaper and clutched her dance card, empty save for the obligatory opening quadrille with her cousin. "They are still whispering about me," she murmured, watching noblewomen behind fans, their eyes darting toward her before quickly looking away. 3 years, and they have not forgotten. At 26, Josephine had long resigned herself to spinsterhood. Once she had been the diamond of the season, beautiful and sought after with a respectable dowry. Now she was merely the forgotten lady, the woman who had nearly married a viscount before he publicly jilted her for an American heiress. The humiliation had been complete, abandoned at the altar before 200 of society's finest, her white gown becoming a shroud for her hopes and reputation. "You need not have come tonight," whispered her cousin Eliza, materializing at her side with 2 crystal glasses of punch. Aunt Margaret would have understood. Josephine accepted the drink but kept her eyes fixed on the dancers. "I cannot hide forever. Besides, I am merely an obligation to Aunt Margaret now. She has finally secured an advantageous match for you. The least I can do is fade into the background and ensure nothing distracts from your triumph." The truth was more complicated. Josephine had come to accept that love was a privilege reserved for those with unblemished reputations and substantial fortunes, neither of which she possessed any longer. Her father's death shortly after her broken engagement had revealed debts that consumed most of her dowry. Now she lived on her aunt's charity, serving as unpaid companion and occasional governess to her younger cousins. "The Duke of Zennor has arrived," Eliza said suddenly, her voice dropping to an excited whisper. "Just there, speaking with Lord Pembroke." Despite herself, Josephine looked. The crowd seemed to part around him, as though his title commanded even the air to give way. Lord Kieran Zennor had returned to England only months ago after nearly a decade abroad, something involving diplomatic service in Vienna and Paris, if the gossip was accurate. At 35, he was considered formidable rather than handsome. Tall with broad shoulders, dark hair silvering at the temples, and eyes that seemed to assess the worth of everything they beheld. "They say he's hunting for a wife," Eliza continued, though he shows little interest in the debutante's thrown in his path. "Father says his estate needs funds desperately after his brother's mismanagement." "Then he should look to Miss Fairchild and her £50,000, Josephine replied, naming the season's wealthiest heiress. "Not in our direction." Yet even as she spoke, she felt the weight of eyes upon her and looked up to find the Duke staring directly at her from across the ballroom. Something in his gaze, recognition perhaps, made her breath catch. Impossible, she had never been introduced to the Duke of Zennor. His time abroad coincided precisely with her brief ascendancy in society and subsequent fall. Josephine quickly averted her eyes, but her heart continued its treacherous pounding. "I believe I shall visit the ladies' retiring room," she murmured to Eliza. "The heat is making me light-headed." She slipped from the ballroom, following the corridor to where fewer guests ventured. Instead of turning toward the retiring room, however, she continued to a small balcony overlooking the gardens, desperate for fresh air and solitude. The May night was cool but not uncomfortable, and the distant strains of the orchestra provided a melancholy soundtrack to her thoughts. "You are Miss Kensington, are you not?" Josephine spun around, nearly dropping her glass. The Duke of Zennor stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the light from the corridor. Proper etiquette demanded she curtsy, acknowledge his superior rank, and excuse herself immediately from this improper tete-a-tete. Instead, she found herself asking, "How do you know my name, Your Grace? We have never been introduced." His expression remained inscrutable as he stepped onto the balcony, maintaining a proper distance, but still close enough that she could see his features clearly in the moonlight. "I make it my business to know interesting people," he said, his voice deep and measured with the cultured accent of education and privilege. "And a woman who walks away from London's most glittering ball to stare at an empty garden strikes me as interesting indeed." "There is nothing interesting about me, I assure you," Josephine replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Merely a need for fresh air." I disagree. The Duke moved to stand beside her at the balustrade, though he kept his eyes on the garden below rather than her face. You are the only woman in that ballroom who does not simper or scheme for attention. You watch the proceedings as though observing a foreign ritual, familiar with its customs, but no longer a participant. Josephine fought the unsettling feeling that this stranger had seen directly into her soul. Your Grace is remarkably observant. I was a diplomat for many years, Miss Kensington. Reading people became necessary for survival. He turned to face her then, his expression serious. Just as I can read that you are uncomfortable with my presence and would prefer to be alone. Then why remain? She asked boldly, surprising herself. A flicker of something, amusement, crossed his features. Because I find myself preferring your company to the parade of eligible young ladies inside. Would you grant me a few minutes of conversation before propriety forces us to return? Against her better judgment, Josephine nodded. What would the Duke of Zennor wish to discuss with someone like me? Someone like you, he repeated, raising an eyebrow. A well-bred lady of intelligence and composure. I believe we might find numerous topics of interest. He paused. But perhaps we might begin with Vienna, where I understand you spent several months as a girl. Josephine looked at him sharply. How could you possibly know that? Your aunt mentioned it earlier this evening when discussing musical education with Lady Hampshire. Apparently, you studied piano there. For 6 months when I was 15, Josephine confirmed, relaxing slightly. My father had business interests there. It was magical, the music, the architecture. The pastries, the Duke added with unexpected warmth. Especially those, she agreed, finding herself smiling despite her reservations. For the next quarter hour, they discussed the Austrian capital, discovering shared favorite locations and experiences. The Duke spoke with knowledge and passion about art and architecture that surprised Josephine, who had expected the typical aristocratic superficiality. She found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, momentarily forgetting her circumstances. The waltz is beginning, he said abruptly, as the music changed tempo. Would you do me the honor, Miss Kensington? Reality crashed back upon her, here, on the balcony. Where no one will see that I have not been properly introduced to my partner, he replied with a knowing smile. A scandalous breach of etiquette, to be sure, but one I'm willing to risk. I do not dance anymore, Josephine said firmly, taking a step back. I should return to my aunt. His expression grew serious. Why deny yourself something you clearly once enjoyed? I saw how your fingers tapped in rhythm to our conversation. You cannot understand, she replied, unable to keep bitterness from her voice. Dancing requires partners, and I am not the sort of woman gentlemen seek as a partner anymore. Yet here I stand, requesting precisely that. Out of pity or curiosity, neither of which is flattering, Your Grace. The Duke studied her for a long moment. I do not offer pity, Miss Kensington, but I confess to curiosity about a woman who believes herself forgotten, yet carries herself with such dignity. Before she could formulate a response, the balcony door opened, and Aunt Margaret's voice cut through the night air like a knife. Josephine, what on earth are you doing? This is most improper. The older woman stopped short upon recognizing the Duke, her outrage transforming instantly to fawning deference. Your Grace. I had no idea you were acquainted with my niece. We were just discussing Vienna, Lady Hargrove, the Duke replied smoothly. Miss Kensington has been kind enough to refresh my memories of the city. Aunt Margaret's shrewd eyes darted between them, calculating possibilities and dangers with equal speed. How interesting. However, Josephine, your cousin has been looking for you. The Devonshires are about to depart and wish to say farewell. Of course, Aunt, Josephine said, offering a proper curtsy to the Duke. Your Grace, thank you for the conversation. The Duke bowed formally. The pleasure was mine, Miss Kensington. I hope we might continue it another time. As Josephine followed her aunt inside, the older woman whispered furiously, What were you thinking? To be alone with any gentleman is inappropriate, but the Duke of Zennor. His interest cannot be honorable, not for someone in your position. It was merely conversation, Aunt, Josephine replied quietly. Nothing more. See that it remains so. We cannot afford another scandal. Her aunt's voice softened marginally. The Duke requires an heiress or a connection to the highest circles, neither of which you can provide. Do not delude yourself into believing otherwise. Josephine nodded, accepting the truth in her aunt's harsh words. She had learned long ago that love and marriage were transactions in their world, and she had nothing left of value to trade. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite conversations. Josephine kept to the periphery, helping Eliza with her dance card and fetching refreshments for Aunt Margaret. Only once did she allow herself to look for the Duke, finding him surrounded by eager mammas and their daughters, his expression politely distant. It was nearly midnight when the footman approached her with a small folded note. "For Miss Kensington," he murmured discreetly. Josephine opened it away from curious eyes. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, the British Museum, Egyptian Gallery. Vienna deserves a proper conclusion to our discussion. Z. She should refuse. She should destroy the note and forget this bizarre interlude." Yet as she slipped the paper into her reticule, Josephine knew with certainty that tomorrow at 2 o'clock she would be standing among ancient sarcophagi, waiting for a duke who had no business noticing her at all. The British Museum bustled with visitors despite the unseasonable rain that had driven London's fashionable set indoors. Josephine moved through the Egyptian Gallery, ostensibly studying the ancient artifacts while her companion, her younger cousin Beatrice, chatted enthusiastically about a mummy case. "It says he was a priest," Beatrice read from the placard. "Imagine being wrapped up like that for thousands of years." "Quite extraordinary," Josephine agreed absently, her eyes scanning the gallery. It was 5 minutes past 2, and there was no sign of the Duke. Perhaps he had reconsidered. Perhaps he had merely been amusing himself with the scandal-tainted spinster. "Cousin, might we visit the Roman sculptures next?" Beatrice asked. "Timothy Ellsworth said they have statues without any clothes at all." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "I hardly think that's appropriate for a girl of 13, Beatrice. Besides, we've only just arrived." "But we've been here almost 20 minutes, her cousin protested. Had it been so long, Josephine's hope faltered. She had been foolish to come, to imagine that. "Miss Kensington, what a pleasant surprise." The deep voice behind her sent an inappropriate shiver down her spine. Josephine turned to find the Duke of Zennor removing his hat, raindrops still clinging to his greatcoat. "Your Grace," she curtsied, praying her face didn't betray her relief. "Allow me to present my cousin, Miss Beatrice Hargrove." Beatrice executed a wobbling curtsy, her eyes wide. "A real duke," she whispered loudly enough for several nearby patrons to turn and stare. The Duke's mouth twitched. "A pleasure, Miss Hargrove. Are you also interested in Egyptian antiquities?" "Not especially," Beatrice answered with brutal honesty. "Cousin Josephine said we needed cultural education, but I'd rather see the Romans. They're much more exciting, with all the battles and poisonings." "Beatrice," Josephine admonished, mortified. To her surprise, the Duke laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his stern features. "An excellent assessment, Miss Hargrove. The Romans were indeed masters of both conquest and intrigue." He glanced at Josephine. "Perhaps we might view both collections, if your cousin agrees." It was inappropriate. They had no proper chaperone beyond a 13-year-old girl, yet Josephine found herself nodding. "That would be acceptable, provided we keep to the public galleries." For the next hour, they wandered through the museum's grand halls, the Duke proving an unexpectedly knowledgeable guide. He spoke of ancient cities he had visited during his diplomatic travels, describing ruins in Greece and monuments in Egypt with such vivid detail that even Beatrice was captivated. "You've seen so much of the world," Josephine remarked as they paused before a Roman fresco. "London must seem terribly provincial by comparison." "On the contrary," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "I find that true discovery often happens closest to home. One merely needs to look with fresh eyes." There was something in his gaze, an intensity that made her heart quicken despite her resolve to remain indifferent. Josephine looked away first, directing Beatrice's attention to a nearby sculpture. I must confess, Miss Kensington, the Duke continued, his voice lower, I did not encounter you here by chance. The note made that clear, Your Grace, she replied, keeping her tone light. Though I remain puzzled as to why you would seek my company. Perhaps I find conventional society as tedious as you appear to. I never said I found society tedious. You didn't need to. His expression grew serious. 3 times during our conversation last night, you deflected questions about the current season. Your eyes drift whenever fashionable gossip is mentioned. You speak with animation about art and literature, yet withdraw when discussing people. Josephine felt exposed, as though he had stripped away her carefully constructed mask. You are very observant, Your Grace. Kieran, he said suddenly. My name is Kieran. I would be honored if you used it, when propriety permits. The informality startled her. That would be most inappropriate. As is this entire meeting, by society's standards, he acknowledged with a half-smile. Yet here we are. Before she could respond, Beatrice called from several feet away, Cousin Josephine. This statue looks exactly like Mrs. Finlay from church. The moment broken, Josephine moved to join her cousin, aware of the Duke following close behind. As she gently corrected Beatrice on making such comparisons aloud, she noticed a familiar figure entering the gallery, Lady Worthington, one of Aunt Margaret's closest friends and London's most notorious gossip. Your Grace, Josephine said urgently, turning to the Duke. We must part ways immediately. Lady Worthington has just arrived, and if she sees us together, she will undoubtedly report it to every drawing room in Mayfair by nightfall, he finished, following her gaze to the bejeweled matron examining a display case. This way. Without waiting for her response, he guided them toward a side gallery, Beatrice trotting obediently behind. They slipped into a smaller room displaying Greek pottery just as Lady Worthington turned in their direction. That was close, Beatrice whispered dramatically. Is she the one Aunt Margaret says has a face like a hungry pike? Beatrice, Josephine exclaimed, though the Duke's barely suppressed laughter made it difficult to maintain her stern expression. We do not repeat such things, even if they were said in private. Especially if they're accurate, the Duke added with a conspiratorial wink at Beatrice that made the girl giggle. Josephine shook her head, but couldn't prevent her own smile. You shouldn't encourage her, Your Grace. My apologies, he replied, not looking remotely apologetic. Now, shall I escort you both to your carriage? I believe we've risked Lady Worthington's keen eyes long enough for one afternoon. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving London's streets glistening in weak sunshine. The Duke's carriage waited nearby, a magnificent vehicle with his coat of arms emblazoned on the door and a matched pair of greys that drew admiring glances from passers-by. We came by Hackney, Josephine explained, looking for an approaching cab. It should only be a moment before. Nonsense, my carriage is at your disposal, the Duke interrupted, signalling to his footman. Where shall I direct my driver to take you? Hargrove House on Berkeley Square would be ideal, but... Perfect, I have business in that direction myself. He opened the carriage door himself, rather than waiting for the footman, offering his hand to assist them. Josephine hesitated, aware that accepting would further blur the lines of propriety, yet refusing would draw more attention on the busy street. She placed her gloved hand in his, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through her, even through 2 layers of fabric. As the carriage set off, Beatrice immediately began examining the luxurious interior, asking questions about the Duke's horses and how fast they could run. Josephine, meanwhile, sat rigidly on the velvet seat, maintaining a proper distance from their unexpected benefactor. You seem troubled, Miss Kensington, the Duke observed when Beatrice's attention was captured by the passing scenery. I am concerned about appearances, Your Grace, she replied honestly. Being seen in your private carriage will invite speculation. Would that be so terrible? He asked quietly. For you, perhaps not for me. She looked down at her hands, tightly clasped in her lap. My reputation cannot withstand further damage. Something in her tone must have conveyed the depth of her meaning, for the Duke's expression sobered. I would never intentionally compromise your standing, Miss Kensington. If I have done so through carelessness, I apologize sincerely. Your intentions are not the issue, she said, keeping her voice low enough that Beatrice wouldn't hear. Society requires no evidence beyond circumstance to condemn a woman. The truth is irrelevant beside the appearance of impropriety. The Duke studied her, his dark eyes thoughtful. You speak from experience. It wasn't a question, but Josephine found herself responding anyway. 3 years ago, I was abandoned at the altar by Viscount Merrick, who decided an American railroad heiress made a more suitable bride. Society largely blamed me for failing to secure his affections properly. That's absurd, the Duke said sharply, causing Beatrice to look over in surprise before returning to her window gazing. More quietly, he continued, no person of sense could hold you responsible for another's dishonorable conduct. And yet they did, and do still. Josephine attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Hence my concern about being seen with you today. Tongues will wag about the forgotten lady trying to entrap another nobleman. Entrap, the Duke looked genuinely offended. Anyone who knows me would laugh at such a notion. I have never been trapped into anything in my life. The carriage slowed as they approached Berkeley Square, and Josephine gathered her reticule, preparing to exit. Nevertheless, I would prefer to avoid providing more fuel for gossip. Perhaps it would be best if you did not acknowledge our acquaintance at future social gatherings. The Duke's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the carriage came to a halt before Hargrove House. The footman opened the door and lowered the steps. Beatrice scrambled out first, exclaiming over the Duke's magnificent horses to the amused driver. As Josephine prepared to follow, the Duke gently caught her wrist. I have a request before you go. She looked at him warily. Yes. Lady Pembroke's musical evening tomorrow. I understand your family will attend. Grant me one conversation, properly chaperoned in full view of society. Let me demonstrate that I have no fear of acknowledging our acquaintance publicly. Josephine hesitated. To what end, Your Grace? To prove that not all of society is as narrow-minded as you believe, he replied, releasing her wrist. And perhaps to continue our discussion of Vienna's architecture, which we never properly finished. Against her better judgment, Josephine found herself nodding. One conversation. The Duke smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his austere features and caused an unwelcome flutter in her chest. Until tomorrow, then. As the carriage pulled away, Beatrice tugged at Josephine's sleeve. Is the Duke in love with you, cousin? He looks at you the way Papa looks at Cook's apple tarts. Don't be ridiculous, Josephine replied, guiding her toward the house. The Duke is merely being polite to someone he met by chance. Yet as she glanced back at the departing carriage, Josephine couldn't quite convince herself that politeness alone explained the warmth in Kieran Zennор's eyes when he looked at her, or the answering warmth she felt whenever he did. Lady Pembroke's musical evening proved every bit as crowded as Josephine had feared. The cream of London society packed into the elegant townhouse, ostensibly to hear a renowned Italian soprano, but primarily to see and be seen. Josephine kept close to Aunt Margaret and Eliza, helping the latter navigate the attentions of several eligible gentlemen while avoiding scrutiny herself. The Duke of Zennor is watching you, Eliza whispered during a brief moment alone between performances. He hasn't taken his eyes off you since we arrived. Josephine refused to look in his direction. Nonsense, he's probably looking at the Fairchild girl. I hear Lord Pembroke seated them together for supper. Josephine, Eliza's tone grew serious. Be careful, Aunt Margaret would never approve, and after last time. There is nothing to approve or disapprove, Josephine replied firmly. The Duke and I exchanged a few words at the Granville Ball about Vienna, nothing more. The lie of omission pained her, but Josephine knew Eliza couldn't keep secrets from her mother. Better that no one knew about the museum visit or the carriage ride, or the way the Duke's voice lingered in her thoughts long after they'd parted. The soprano began her next aria, and conversation ceased. Josephine allowed the music to wash over her, keeping her eyes fixed on the performer rather than searching the room for a certain tall figure. When applause erupted at the conclusion, she joined in automatically, lost in her own thoughts. Miss Kensington. The deep voice beside her made Josephine start. The Duke of Zennor had materialized at her elbow during the commotion, immaculate in evening wear that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding presence. "Your Grace," she acknowledged with a proper curtsy, aware of curious glances from nearby guests. "Did you enjoy the performance?" "Immensely, though I confess Italian opera has never stirred me as deeply as the German compositions I heard in Vienna." His eyes held hers meaningfully. "I believe you mentioned a fondness for Mozart during our previous conversation." "Indeed," Josephine replied, conscious of Eliza's wide-eyed stare beside her. "His Requiem in particular." "A connoisseur of the melancholy," the Duke observed. "Though I would have thought the lighter concertos might appeal more to your sensibilities." "One's tastes often evolve with experience, Your Grace." Something like understanding flickered in his eyes. "Indeed they do. Would you permit me to escort you to the refreshment room? I believe Lady Pembroke has arranged for ices between performances." Josephine hesitated, but Eliza gave her a small push forward. "Go on, cousin. Aunt Margaret is deep in conversation with the Countess of Rutland and won't miss you for a few minutes." With a mixture of trepidation and anticipation, Josephine placed her hand on the Duke's proffered arm. They moved through the crowd, which parted before them like the Red Sea, whispers following in their wake. "You see," the Duke murmured as they entered the less crowded refreshment room. "Proper acknowledgement in full society, as promised. And tomorrow the gossips will speculate on why the Duke of Zennor showed attention to the disgraced Miss Kensington," she replied quietly. His jaw tightened. "Is that truly how you see yourself, disgraced?" "It is how society sees me," Josephine corrected, accepting a glass of punch from a footman. "I have learned to accept reality, Your Grace." "Kieran," he reminded her, leading her toward a relatively private corner where they could converse without being overheard. "And I find that what society perceives as reality often bears little resemblance to truth." "A philosopher as well as a diplomat," Josephine observed, unable to keep a hint of teasing from her voice. The Duke, Kieran, smiled, revealing a dimple she hadn't noticed before. "A pragmatist who has seen enough of the world to know that London drawing rooms are not the arbiters of true worth." "Easy to say when one is a duke," she countered. "Your position shields you from the worst of society's judgments." "Does it?" His expression grew serious. "My title did not prevent whispers when my brother died in a gambling hell with empty pockets and a mistress at his side. It did not shield my family when he was revealed to have embezzled from our tenants to pay his debts." Josephine stared at him, stunned by the frank admission. I had not heard of that." "Few have. My father managed to suppress most of the scandal before his own death, and I have spent the last decade repairing the damage to our estates and reputation." Kieran's voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity. "So you see, Miss Kensington, I understand something of living under the shadow of another's mistakes." The vulnerability in his confession touched Josephine deeply. Without thinking, she placed her hand briefly on his arm. "I am sorry for your family's suffering." "As I am for yours," he replied, his eyes warm. "Though I confess, I find it difficult to believe that London society could be foolish enough to blame you for a viscount's dishonourable conduct." "It wasn't only that," Josephine admitted, surprised at her own candour. "After he jilted me, rumours spread that I had trapped him into the engagement through improper behaviour. Then my father died suddenly, revealing massive debts that seemed to confirm my desperation. The combination proved too scandalous for redemption." "And the Viscount, did he suffer similar censure?" "Hardly." Josephine couldn't keep bitterness from her voice. "He married his American heiress 6 months later and was welcomed back into society with open arms. I understand they are currently in Italy on an extended tour." Kieran's expression darkened. "The injustice of it is merely the way of the world," she finished for him. "Men may falter and be forgiven. Women must be above reproach or face permanent condemnation." Before he could respond, a commotion at the entrance to the refreshment room drew their attention. Aunt Margaret stood in the doorway, her face a mask of barely controlled fury as she scanned the crowd. When her eyes landed on Josephine and the Duke, she marched toward them with determination that made several guests scramble out of her path. "Josephine," she hissed upon reaching them, offering a perfunctory curtsy to the Duke. "You are needed immediately. Eliza has developed a megrim, and we must depart." The lie was transparent. Eliza had been in perfect health minutes ago, but Josephine knew better than to contradict her aunt in public. "Of course, Aunt." "Please excuse me, Your Grace." Kieran bowed formally. "I hope Miss Hargrove recovers swiftly. It was a pleasure conversing with you, Miss Kensington." "The pleasure was mine," Josephine replied automatically, though she meant it with unexpected sincerity. As Aunt Margaret practically dragged her from the room, Josephine risked one glance back. Kieran stood watching her departure, his expression unreadable to most, but Josephine thought she detected concern and something else that made her heart beat faster despite her best intentions. The carriage ride home was excruciating. Aunt Margaret waited only until the door closed behind them before unleashing her displeasure. "Have you taken leave of your senses?" she demanded. "Conversing privately with the Duke of Zennor for all society to witness. Do you wish to become even more of a pariah than you already are?" "We were hardly private, Aunt," Josephine defended herself, noting that Eliza looked perfectly healthy beside her. "We were in the refreshment room, with dozens of others present. Secluded in a corner, deep in conversation. Already Lady Worthington was speculating that you mean to entrap him as you did Merrick." The accusation strung, even though Josephine had anticipated it. "I did not entrap Viscount Merrick, nor am I attempting to entrap the Duke. He approached me regarding mutual acquaintances from Vienna." "Vienna, that was over a decade ago, child. What possible relevance could it have now?" "The Duke spent considerable time there during his diplomatic service," Josephine explained, fighting to keep her voice steady. "It was merely a topic of shared interest." Aunt Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Shared interest? Josephine, you cannot be so naive. The Duke requires an heiress to restore his family's fortunes. He would never seriously consider someone in your position unless his intentions are dishonorable." "The Duke has been nothing but respectful," Josephine protested, heat rising to her cheeks. "Of course he appears respectful. Men of his rank are expert at maintaining appearances while pursuing their true aims." Her aunt's voice softened marginally. "My dear, after what happened with Merrick, I would think you'd be more cautious about a gentleman's attentions." "This is entirely different," Josephine insisted, though doubt crept in despite her words. What did the Duke truly want from her? Their conversations had seemed genuine, his interest sincere, but she had believed the same of Viscount Merrick once. "For your own protection, you will avoid the Duke of Zennor at future engagements," Aunt Margaret declared as the carriage pulled up to Hargrove House. "I forbid you to encourage his attention in any way. The gossip is dangerous enough already." Josephine said nothing as they entered the house, retreating to her bedroom with a polite excuse about fatigue. Once alone, she sat at her small writing desk and withdrew a sheet of paper. "Your Grace," she wrote, then crossed it out. "Kieran," she began again, only to crumple the paper entirely. What could she possibly say? That she enjoyed their conversations more than she should, that despite her better judgment, she found herself thinking of him constantly. That even knowing the dangers to her already damaged reputation, she wished to see him again. All true and all impossible to admit. In the end, Josephine wrote nothing. She extinguished her candle and lay in darkness, trying to convince herself that her aunt was right, that whatever interest the Duke of Zennor had shown in her could lead only to further heartbreak and disgrace. Yet as sleep finally claimed her, Josephine's last conscious thought was of Kieran's voice saying her name, and the warmth it kindled in her despite all her carefully constructed defenses. For the next fortnight, Josephine adhered to her aunt's directive, avoiding any gathering where the Duke of Zennor might be present. She declined invitations to musical evenings and afternoon teas, volunteering instead to accompany Beatrice to her lessons or help the housekeeper with household accounts, anything to keep busy and away from temptation. If Aunt Margaret noticed her sudden devotion to domestic duties, she made no comment beyond expressing approval at Josephine's sensible choice to avoid further gossip. Then came the invitation that could not be declined. Lady Rothwell's midsummer ball, the social event of the season. As patrons of Eliza's intended match with Lord Halford, the Hargroves were expected to attend and show support for the alliance. Josephine's absence would be noted and questioned. "You will wear the blue silk," Aunt Margaret announced the day before the ball, reviewing Josephine's limited wardrobe with a critical eye. "It is modest enough to be appropriate for your age and situation, yet not so drab as to embarrass the family." Josephine nodded, knowing better than to mention that the gown was 3 seasons out of date, its once fashionable sleeves now noticeably passé. "Yes, Aunt. And you will remain with me or near Eliza throughout the evening. No wandering off to balconies or refreshment rooms alone." Her aunt's meaning was clear without the Duke being named. "I understand," Josephine replied quietly. That night, as her lady's maid prepared the blue silk for the following evening, Josephine found herself staring at her reflection in the small mirror above her dressing table. At 26, she was no longer the fresh-faced debutante who had once captured Viscount Merrick's attention. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes now, and a certain guardedness in her expression that hadn't been there before his betrayal. What did Kieran see when he looked at her? Not beauty. She had never been a classic beauty, even in her prime. Not fortune or connections, both diminished by circumstances. What possible attraction could she hold for a duke who could have his choice of London's most eligible young ladies? Unless Aunt Margaret was right, and his intentions were dishonourable. The thought lodged like a stone in Josephine's chest. She had been deceived once by a charming viscount. Was she now allowing herself to be manipulated by a duke with greater finesse? Yet something in her rebelled against that interpretation. The man who spoke so candidly about his brother's mistakes, who noticed her discomfort at the British Museum and acted to protect her from gossip, who looked at her as though truly seeing her, that man did not seem capable of calculated deception. Confused and conflicted, Josephine slept poorly. By the time the Hargrove carriage departed for Lady Rothwell's estate the following evening, dark shadows circled her eyes, partially concealed by judicious application of rice powder. Rothwell House blazed with light, its grand entrance crowded with carriages disgorging London's elite in their finest attire. Inside, the ballroom had been transformed into a midsummer fantasy, with garlands of flowers adorning every pillar and hothouse blooms arranged in magnificent displays. "Remember," Aunt Margaret murmured as they were announced, "dignity and restraint. Stay where I can see you." Josephine nodded dutifully, though her eyes involuntarily scanned the crowded room. She told herself she wasn't looking for Kieran, merely assessing the gathering to identify safe conversation partners for the evening. For the first hour, she adhered perfectly to her aunt's dictates, remaining close to the matron's section and engaging in polite small talk with the few ladies who acknowledged her. Eliza danced every set, her engagement to Lord Halford now common knowledge and celebrated by all. Josephine was discussing the flower arrangements with elderly Mrs. Fitzwilliam when a familiar deep voice behind her made her heart leap. "Good evening, Mrs. Fitzwilliam, Miss Kensington." She turned slowly, willing her expression to remain neutral as she faced the Duke of Zennor. He looked magnificent in formal evening wear, the stark black and white emphasizing his height and the breadth of his shoulders. Something in his eyes, concern, disappointment, suggested he had noticed her avoidance over the past weeks. "Your Grace," both women curtsied, Mrs. Fitzwilliam with considerably more enthusiasm. "How delightful to see you, Your Grace," the older woman gushed. "I was just telling Miss Kensington how clever Lady Rothwell has been with her floral designs this year." "Indeed," Kieran agreed, though his eyes remained on Josephine. "I understand the roses were imported specially from France." "Oh, I must ask Lady Rothwell about her supplier," Mrs. Fitzwilliam exclaimed. "My own gardener has been utterly incapable of producing blooms of that quality, if you'll excuse me." Before Josephine could protest, the elderly lady tottered off, leaving her alone with the Duke. She glanced desperately toward Aunt Margaret, but her chaperone was deep in conversation with the Countess of Rutland, her back to the ballroom. "You've been avoiding me," Kieran said without preamble, his voice low enough that nearby guests couldn't overhear. I have been occupied with family matters, Josephine replied, not meeting his eyes. For 14 days, since the exact evening your aunt discovered us conversing at Lady Pembroke's. His tone made it clear he didn't believe her excuse. My movements are not your concern, Your Grace, she said stiffly. Kieran, he corrected automatically, and they have become my concern, whether you wish it or not. Something in his voice, an intensity that matched the heat in his gaze, made Josephine look up at last. Why should you care whether I attend musical evenings or afternoon teas? Because I have found no one else in London society whose conversation I enjoy half as much, he answered simply. Because when you disappeared, I discovered I missed your wit and perception far more than I should after such brief acquaintance. Josephine felt her resolve weakening. You flatter me unnecessarily, Your Grace. Kieran, he insisted. And I have never flattered anyone unnecessarily in my life. Ask any diplomat who has negotiated with me. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I am notorious for painful honesty. Despite herself, Josephine felt an answering smile form. A diplomatic liability, surely. At times, he agreed, his expression warming at her response. Though I found it earned respect, even when it cost me popularity. The orchestra began the opening strains of a waltz, and Kieran's expression grew serious once more. Will you dance with me, Josephine? The use of her given name, so intimate and unexpected, made her breath catch. I don't think. One dance, he pressed, in full view of the entire assembly, no hidden corners or private balconies. Let me demonstrate that I am not ashamed to be seen with you, whatever your aunt may have suggested. How did he know? Had her aunt's concerns been so transparent, or did he simply understand the workings of society that well? Either way, his accurate assessment of the situation disarmed her. Very well, Josephine conceded. One dance. Kieran offered his arm, leading her onto the floor where other couples were already forming. As they took their positions, Josephine became acutely aware of the attention they attracted, curious glances, whispered comments behind fans, even a few openly disapproving frowns. Everyone is watching, she murmured as Kieran's hand settled at her waist, the proprietary touch sending warmth through her despite the barrier of silk and corset. Let them, he replied, his eyes never leaving hers as they began to move with the music. I care only for the opinion of one person in this room, and she is currently in my arms. Josephine nearly missed a step at his bold declaration. You should not say such things. Why not? It is the truth. His hand tightened slightly at her waist, guiding her through a turn. I have spent 2 weeks attempting to be patient, to respect your apparent wish for distance. But my patience has limits, especially when I suspect your avoidance stems not from personal disinclination, but from others' interference. My aunt believes you cannot have honorable intentions towards someone in my position, Josephine admitted, lowering her voice. She forbade me from encouraging your attention. Something dangerous flashed in Kieran's eyes. And what do you believe, Josephine? The directness of the question took her aback. I don't know what to believe, she confessed. Experience has taught me to be wary of attention from men of rank and title. Because of Merrick, he stated rather than asked. Yes. Kieran guided her through another turn, his movements strong and sure. I am not Merrick, he said simply. I have never abandoned my responsibilities or broken my word. I don't pursue women for fortune or fleeting amusement. Then why pursue me at all? Josephine asked, the question that had plagued her for weeks finally spoken aloud. I have neither beauty nor fortune to recommend me. My connections are modest at best. There are dozens of eligible young ladies in London better suited to be a duchess. The music was building toward its conclusion, and Kieran drew her infinitesimally closer, still proper, but intimate enough to speak without being overheard. Because from the moment I saw you at the Granville Ball, standing apart from the crowd with quiet dignity despite their whispers, I recognized something in you that called to me, he said, his voice low and intense. Intelligence, strength. A depth of character forged through adversity. The waltz ended, and couples around them began to separate, but Kieran maintained his light hold on her hand. I don't want a decorative wife bred to simper and agree with my every word. I want a partner, someone who understands that life contains both triumph and loss, and faces both with courage. Josephine stared at him, speechless at the unexpected declaration. Before she could formulate a response, Aunt Margaret materialized beside them, her pinched expression making her disapproval clear. Josephine, Lord Halford wishes to introduce Eliza to his grandmother. Your presence is requested. She offered the Duke a frigid smile. Your Grace, thank you for honoring my niece with a dance. Kieran bowed formally, though Josephine detected irritation in the set of his shoulders. The honor was entirely mine, Lady Hargrove. Miss Kensington is a superior dancer. How kind of you to say so, Aunt Margaret replied, already taking Josephine's arm to lead her away. If you'll excuse us. Josephine allowed herself to be guided across the ballroom, but not before glancing back at Kieran, who remained watching her with an intensity that made her shiver despite the warm evening. I thought I made myself clear about encouraging the Duke's attention, Aunt Margaret hissed once they were out of earshot. What were you thinking, accepting a waltz with him? The entire room is buzzing with speculation. He asked, and I could hardly refuse without creating a scene. Josephine defended herself, though she knew she could have found a polite way to decline had she truly wished to. This ends tonight, her aunt declared. We are leaving early. I will tell Lady Rothwell that Eliza is overtired from the excitement of her engagement. But Eliza is enjoying herself, Josephine protested, glancing toward her cousin, who was laughing with Lord Halford and a group of young people. She will have many more balls to enjoy as Lady Halford, Aunt Margaret said firmly. I will not risk her future happiness or this family's reputation because of your reckless behavior. The accusations strung, especially since Josephine had spent years carefully guarding what remained of her reputation. One dance, that was all she had allowed herself with Kieran. Yet as she followed her aunt toward Eliza, Josephine couldn't dismiss Kieran's words so easily. A partner, not a decoration, someone who understands both triumph and loss. The sincerity in his voice had seemed unmistakable, unless she was once again being blinded by wishful thinking. Across the ballroom, she saw him in conversation with Lord Pembroke, his tall figure unmistakable among the crowd. As though sensing her gaze, he looked up, their eyes meeting briefly across the distance. In that moment, Josephine made a decision. She would not leave without speaking to him once more, not to encourage false hopes, but to end whatever this was between them clearly and honestly. She owed him that much, at least. Aunt, she said quietly, I need a moment to visit the ladies' retiring room before we depart. I will join you at the entrance hall in 10 minutes. Aunt Margaret frowned but nodded. Don't dawdle. I'll send a maid to fetch you if you're late. Once her aunt moved away to collect Eliza, Josephine made her way not toward the retiring room, but toward where she had last seen Kieran. He was no longer with Lord Pembroke, however, and a quick scan of the ballroom failed to locate him. Looking for someone. The familiar voice behind her made Josephine turn. Kieran stood in the entrance to a small antechamber off the main ballroom, watching her with a knowing expression. My aunt insists we leave early, she explained, moving toward him. I wanted to speak with you before we go. He gestured to the antechamber, which contained several settees and was currently unoccupied. We can speak more privately here, though I suspect your aunt would disapprove. She would, Josephine agreed, but entered anyway, conscious that she had only minutes before her absence would be noted. Which is partly why I sought you out. Kieran followed her in but left the door open, maintaining propriety while allowing some privacy. I'm listening. What you said during our dance, Josephine began, struggling to find the right words. It was beautiful, and in another life, I would be deeply honored. But the reality is that my reputation and circumstances make any connection between us impossible. My aunt is right about that, if nothing else. Is she? Kieran stepped closer, his expression intent. Tell me, Josephine, if there were no aunts, no society gossips, no past scandals to consider, what would your answer be then? That's an unfair question, she protested. We cannot simply ignore reality. Humor me, he pressed. In this room, for this moment, let there be only truth between us. If you could choose freely, would you allow me to court you properly?" Josephine looked up at him, at the sincerity and hope in his eyes, and found she couldn't lie. "Yes," she admitted softly, "I would." Something like triumph flashed across his features. "Then that is all I need to know." "But it changes nothing," Josephine insisted. "My aunt will never approve. Society will crucify us both, you for lowering yourself, me for presuming to rise above my station." "Let me worry about society," Kieran said, his voice taking on a determined edge she hadn't heard before. "As for your aunt, Josephine Kensington." Aunt Margaret's voice, sharp with fury, cut through the air like a knife. She stood in the doorway, her face pale with anger, Eliza hovering anxiously behind her. "I have been searching everywhere for you," she continued, her voice trembling. "And now I find you secreted away with the Duke, after everything I said." "Lady Hargrove," Kieran began, his tone respectful but firm. "I assure you—" "I require no assurances from you, Your Grace," Aunt Margaret interrupted with icy formality. "It is clear your interest in my niece is exactly as I feared. Josephine, come away this instant." "We are leaving." Mortification heated Josephine's cheeks as she moved to obey, conscious of curious onlookers gathering beyond her aunt. This was exactly the sort of scene she had spent years avoiding, public humiliation that would only reinforce society's low opinion of her. "I apologize for the disruption," she murmured to Kieran as she passed him. He caught her hand briefly. "This isn't over," he promised quietly before releasing her. The journey home passed in excruciating silence. Even Eliza, normally chatty after social events, kept her eyes fixed on the carriage window, clearly afraid to draw her mother's wrath. Only when they entered Hargrove House did Aunt Margaret finally speak. "Go to your rooms, girls," she instructed Eliza. "I need to speak with Josephine privately." Once alone in the drawing room, her aunt turned to her with an expression of profound disappointment. "I have tried to be patient with you, Josephine. I took you in when your father's debts left you destitute. I have provided for you these 3 years without complaint. And how do you repay my generosity? By bringing scandal upon this house once again." "There was no scandal," Josephine defended herself. "We were merely talking." In a private antechamber, with the Duke of Zennor, her aunt's voice rose. Already the whispers have begun. "Lady Worthington informed me that several guests witnessed your encounter and drew the obvious conclusion." "What conclusion?" Josephine asked, though she feared she knew the answer. "That you are trying to entrap another nobleman through compromise, just as you attempted with Merrick." The words fell like stones between them. "Only this time you've aimed even higher, a duke instead of a viscount." The injustice of the accusation stole Josephine's breath. "That's not true. I never tried to trap Viscount Merrick. He proposed to me voluntarily, then abandoned me when a wealthier option appeared." "That is not what society believes," Aunt Margaret replied implacably. "And now you have confirmed their worst suspicions about your character. By speaking privately with a gentleman for 5 minutes." Josephine couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "While the door remained open and dozens of people passed by. If that constitutes a scandal, then half the young ladies in London should be ruined." "You are not half the young ladies in London," her aunt snapped. "You are a woman with a tarnished reputation, living on the charity of relatives. Different standards apply to you, whether you think it fair or not." The harsh truth of the statement silenced Josephine momentarily. Her aunt was right. Society's judgment was neither fair nor consistent, but it was real nonetheless. "What would you have me do?" she asked finally, her voice small. Aunt Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Leave London, tomorrow. My sister in Bath has agreed to take you in for the remainder of the season. By the time you return, this latest indiscretion will hopefully be forgotten." "Bath?" Josephine stared at her aunt in disbelief. "You would send me away like a misbehaving child." "I would protect what remains of your reputation and this family's standing," her aunt corrected. "Eliza's engagement to Lord Halford is too important to risk." Understanding dawned painfully. "You fear my scandal will taint Eliza's prospects." Can you blame me? Aunt Margaret asked frankly. Lord Halford's family is extremely conscious of appearances, if they believe Eliza comes from a household where improper behavior is tolerated. She left the implication hanging, but Josephine understood. Her cousin's happiness, her entire future, could be jeopardized by association with Josephine's perceived indiscretions. When must I leave? She asked quietly. The morning coach departs at 9, her aunt replied, relief evident in her tone. Thompson will help you pack tonight. Josephine nodded, resigned. Very well, if you'll excuse me, I'll begin preparations now. As she climbed the stairs to her modest bedchamber, Josephine felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Once again, she was being banished for a sin she hadn't committed, sacrificed on the altar of society's judgment and family reputation. Only this time, there was a dull ache in her chest that hadn't been there before. An ache that bore the name and face of a duke who had looked at her as though she mattered, as though she were worthy of being chosen, not merely tolerated. In her room, Josephine began methodically removing items from her wardrobe, folding each carefully for the journey to Bath. Tomorrow she would leave London, leave Kieran, without even a chance to explain or say goodbye. It was better this way, she told herself firmly. A clean break rather than a prolonged, painful unwinding of whatever fragile connection had formed between them. Yet as she packed the blue silk gown she had worn that evening, Josephine couldn't prevent a single tear from falling onto the fabric, leaving a small, dark stain over the heart. The morning dawned grey and drizzling, as though the weather itself understood Josephine's mood. She dressed simply for travel in her serviceable brown wool, her few possessions already packed in a modest trunk and valise. Breakfast was a silent affair, with Aunt Margaret reviewing last-minute instructions and Eliza occasionally squeezing Josephine's hand beneath the table in wordless sympathy. My sister will meet you at the Bath coach station, Aunt Margaret said as the mantel clock struck 8. I've written to inform her of the circumstances, so there's no need for elaborate explanations. Josephine nodded, wondering exactly what circumstances her aunt had described in the letter. Had she painted Josephine as a willing participant in scandal, or merely its unfortunate victim? Either way, the result was the same: exile from London and separation from the only man who had made her heart race since Merrick's betrayal. The carriage is ready, miss, Thompson announced from the doorway. Your trunk has been loaded. Thank you, Thompson. Josephine rose, smoothing her skirts. Well, I suppose this is goodbye for now. Eliza burst into tears, flinging her arms around Josephine. It's not fair, you didn't do anything wrong. Eliza, compose yourself, Aunt Margaret scolded, though her own expression held a trace of regret. Your cousin will return after the season. This is merely a temporary measure for everyone's benefit. Including mine, Josephine added, gently disentangling herself from Eliza's embrace. Bath is lovely this time of year, I'm told. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Bath might indeed be lovely, but spending the summer with a relative she barely knew, explaining her sudden appearance to curious neighbours, held little appeal. After final embraces and promises to write, Josephine followed Thompson to the waiting carriage. The drizzle had increased to a steady rain, forcing her to hold her umbrella close as she descended the front steps. She was so focused on avoiding puddles that she almost didn't notice the magnificent carriage parked directly behind her aunt's more modest vehicle, or the tall figure who emerged from it as she approached. Good morning, Miss Kensington. Kieran's voice, calm and assured, stopped Josephine in her tracks. He stood beneath a large black umbrella, impeccably dressed despite the early hour and inclement weather. Your Grace, she gasped, nearly dropping her reticule in shock. What are you doing here? Preventing a grave mistake, he replied, stepping closer. Specifically, your departure for Bath. Behind her, Josephine heard the front door open and Aunt Margaret's outraged exclamation. Your Grace, this is most irregular. Kieran acknowledged the older woman with a respectful nod, but kept his attention fixed on Josephine. I apologize for arriving unannounced, Lady Hargrove, but I couldn't allow Miss Kensington to leave without speaking to her. My niece has a coach to catch, Aunt Margaret said stiffly, descending the steps to join them on the wet pavement. Whatever you wish to say must wait for another time. I'm afraid it cannot. Kieran's tone remained polite, but held an underlying steel that made it clear he would not be deterred. What I have to say concerns Miss Kensington's future, and possibly her reputation. The mention of reputation caught Aunt Margaret's attention. Her reputation, what do you mean? Kieran glanced at Josephine, something like apology in his eyes. Perhaps we might continue this conversation inside. The rain is becoming rather insistent. Aunt Margaret hesitated, clearly torn between proper hospitality and her determination to send Josephine away. Finally, propriety won out. Very well. Thompson, return Miss Kensington's trunk to her room for now. The rest of you, come inside before we all catch our deaths. Once settled in the drawing room, Josephine and her aunt seated, Kieran standing by the mantel, an awkward silence descended. Eliza hovered in the doorway until a sharp look from her mother sent her reluctantly upstairs. Now, Your Grace, Aunt Margaret began with forced calm, what is so urgent that it requires interrupting our morning at this unseemly hour? I understand Miss Kensington is being sent to Bath because of what occurred at Lady Rothwell's ball, Kieran stated directly. A decision based on concern for her reputation and your family's standing. That is correct, Aunt Margaret confirmed, her expression guarded. Then I must inform you that her departure would cause far more damage than her remaining in London. Josephine stared at him, bewildered. I don't understand. Kieran turned to face her fully, his expression softening. After your aunt removed you from Lady Rothwell's ball last night, I found myself surrounded by curious inquiries about our connection. It seems your conversation with me in the antechamber was observed by numerous guests, including Lady Worthington. I am well aware, Aunt Margaret said grimly. What you may not be aware of, Kieran continued, is that I responded to these inquiries by informing Lady Worthington, and by extension, all of London society, that I have been paying court to Miss Kensington with honourable intentions. Josephine's breath caught in her throat. You what? It was the truth, he replied simply, though perhaps premature in its public declaration. Premature, Aunt Margaret exclaimed. Your Grace, if this is some misguided attempt at gallantry. It is nothing of the sort, Kieran interrupted, his voice firm. My interest in your niece is sincere and has been from our first meeting. I had intended to approach you formally after establishing a deeper acquaintance with Miss Kensington, but circumstances have forced my hand. He turned back to Josephine, his expression earnest. If you leave London now, after my declaration, society will assume one of two things. Either that I was refused, which damages my pride but little else, or that you are fleeing from impropriety, which confirms the worst suspicions about both of us. The logic was impeccable, and Josephine knew it. Whether intentionally or not, Kieran had maneuvered them into a position where her departure would create precisely the scandal her aunt hoped to avoid. What exactly are you proposing, Your Grace? Aunt Margaret asked, her voice frosty. I am proposing that Miss Kensington remain in London, Kieran answered, that she continue to attend social functions under your chaperonage, and that she permit me to court her openly and honourably with your blessing. Court her, Aunt Margaret repeated, astonishment replacing anger. Your Grace, while I appreciate the gesture, surely you understand that a duke and a woman of intelligence, courage, and impeccable lineage despite reduced circumstances, Kieran finished for her. Yes, I understand precisely what such a match would entail. I assure you I have considered it thoroughly. He moved to stand before Josephine, who remained frozen in her seat, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. The only opinion that matters now is yours, Josephine. Will you allow me to court you properly? The use of her given name in front of her aunt would once have scandalized Josephine. Now it barely registered compared to the monumental question being asked. She looked up into Kieran's eyes, searching for any trace of pity or obligation that would suggest his offer stemmed from duty rather than desire. She found only sincerity and something warmer that made her heart race. Why? She asked softly. Why would you choose me when you could have anyone? Because anyone is not you, he replied simply. Because in a world of artifice and shallow connections, you offer substance and truth. Because when I look at you, I see not who you were or what happened to you, but who you are and who we might be together. The words struck Josephine with the force of revelation. For years, she had defined herself by Merrick's rejection and society's judgment, believing their assessment of her worth more than her own. Kieran was offering something radically different, the chance to be valued for herself, not despite her past, but independent of it entirely. My aunt is right about one thing, Josephine said slowly. There will be talk, your family may object, society will question your judgment. Let them, Kieran replied, with the same confidence he had shown during their dance. I have faced worse opposition in diplomatic circles. Besides, I find I care less for society's opinion with each passing day in your company. Josephine looked to her aunt, expecting continued resistance. To her surprise, Aunt Margaret's expression had shifted from outrage to calculation. If your Grace is genuinely determined on this course, the older woman said carefully, there are matters of practical consideration to discuss. My niece's circumstances are known to me, Kieran interrupted gently, and irrelevant to my intentions. Aunt Margaret's eyebrows rose, but she merely nodded. I see. Well then, perhaps Miss Kensington's journey to Bath should be postponed, at least temporarily. It was as close to approval as they were likely to get, and Josephine felt a bubble of hysterical laughter rise in her throat. 20 minutes ago, she had been bound for exile. Now she sat in her aunt's drawing room with a duke requesting permission to court her. Josephine, Kieran prompted when she remained silent, you haven't answered my question. She looked up at him, this man who had appended her carefully ordered existence with his persistence and honesty. Yes, she said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, I will allow you to court me, though I warn you, I am not easily impressed by titles or fortune. A slow smile spread across Kieran's face, transforming his serious features. I would expect nothing less. In fact, I count on your ability to see beyond such trappings. Aunt Margaret cleared her throat pointedly. Well, this is all very unexpected. I suppose Thompson should return your trunk from the coach, Josephine. And your Grace, if you wish to call again, properly, during acceptable visiting hours, you would be welcome tomorrow afternoon. Thank you, Lady Hargrove, Kieran replied formally, though his eyes remained on Josephine. I look forward to it. As he prepared to depart, Josephine accompanied him to the foyer, aware of her aunt watching discreetly from the drawing-room doorway. That was quite a performance, she murmured as Thompson retrieved the Duke's hat and gloves. Arriving just as I was leaving, most dramatic. I had to act quickly once I learned of your impending departure, Kieran admitted. Lady Pembroke mentioned it last night after you left. The gossip spreads faster than I thought, Josephine observed wryly. To our benefit in this case, he lowered his voice. I meant every word, Josephine. This is not impulse or gallantry speaking. I have known my own mind on this matter for some time. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Even knowing all the difficulties ahead. Especially knowing them, he confirmed, some things are worth fighting for. The simple declaration, spoken with such conviction, dissolved the last of Josephine's doubts. Whatever came next, society's whispers, family objections, the ghosts of past heartbreak, she would face it with this man who saw her true worth when she had forgotten it herself. Tomorrow afternoon, then, she said, offering her hand. Kieran took it, pressing a proper kiss to her gloved fingers that somehow felt more intimate than any touch she had ever known. Until tomorrow. As the front door closed behind him, Josephine turned to find Aunt Margaret watching her with an inscrutable expression. Well, the older woman said finally, it appears your circumstances have changed rather dramatically in the past half hour. Yes, Josephine agreed, unable to keep a small smile from her lips. They have. You understand this may all come to nothing, her aunt cautioned. The Duke may be sincere, but his family could object. Society will certainly raise eyebrows. I know, Josephine's smile didn't falter. But for the first time in 3 years, I find I'm not afraid of society's judgment. Whatever happens next, whether it leads to heartbreak or happiness, At least it will be my choice. Aunt Margaret studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Perhaps there is more of your father in you than I realized. He always did prefer making his own path, consequences be damned. Coming from her conventional aunt, it was almost a compliment. Josephine accepted it as such, straightening her shoulders with newfound confidence. Now, her aunt continued briskly, we must reconsider your wardrobe if you are to be courted by a duke. That brown wool will certainly not do. As Aunt Margaret launched into plans for modifying Josephine's limited clothing options, Josephine allowed herself a moment of private wonder. Just hours ago, she had been the forgotten lady, a cautionary tale of ruined prospects and diminished hopes. Now, somehow, she stood at the threshold of a new story entirely. Not because a duke had claimed her, she realized with sudden clarity, but because she had finally claimed herself. The weeks that followed transformed Josephine's life with dizzying speed. True to his word, Kieran called at Hargrove House the next afternoon, bringing formal flowers for Aunt Margaret and a slim volume of Viennese poetry for Josephine, a thoughtful gesture that acknowledged their shared connection to the city. His courtship proceeded with meticulous propriety, always chaperoned, always in public venues or respectable drawing rooms. Yet there was nothing cold or distant about his attention. Each conversation revealed new layers of compatibility, shared tastes in literature, similar views on social reform, a mutual distaste for pretense in any form. Society's reaction was precisely as predicted, initial shock giving way to rampant speculation and eventually reluctant fascination. The forgotten lady and the diplomatic duke became the most discussed couple of the late season, their appearances at concerts and gallery exhibitions drawing curious stares and whispered comments. They're all waiting for some scandalous development, Josephine observed during a carriage ride through Hyde Park, Aunt Margaret dozing discreetly across from them. A dramatic jilting or a compromising situation. Then they will be sorely disappointed, Kieran replied, his hand covering hers where it rested on the carriage seat between them. I have no intention of providing either. She smiled, still sometimes startled by his directness. No regrets, then, about choosing such a controversial partner. My only regret, he said seriously, is not returning to England sooner to find you before Merrick had the chance to hurt you. The mention of her former fiancé no longer pained Josephine as it once had. Strange as it sounds, I'm almost grateful for what happened with Merrick now. Grateful? Kieran raised an eyebrow. If he hadn't revealed his true character before we married, I might have spent years bound to a man who valued wealth above loyalty, she explained. And I would never have learned my own strength or met you. Kieran's expression softened. A generous perspective, though I still maintain he was an utter fool to let you go. His loss your gain, Josephine teased lightly. Precisely, he squeezed her hand gently. Though I'd like to think I would have recognized your worth regardless of circumstances. As July turned to August, their connection deepened beyond mutual attraction to something more profound. Kieran confided his struggles to restore his family estates after his brother's mismanagement, while Josephine shared her fears about depending too much on others after her father's financial collapse. I've lived these past 3 years grateful for charity I resented, she admitted during a quiet moment in Aunt Margaret's garden, afraid to want anything for myself lest it be taken away again. And now, Kieran asked, his eyes intent on her face. Now I find myself wanting very much indeed, she replied softly, and terrified by how much it would hurt to lose. He moved closer, though still maintaining a proper distance. I am not something you would lose, Josephine. I am someone who would stand beside you through whatever comes. The certainty in his voice gave her courage. Is that a promise, Your Grace? It's more than that, he replied, his expression solemn. It's a future, if you'll share it with me. The meaning behind his words was unmistakable, though he offered no formal proposal that day. Both understood that certain conversations required more privacy than a garden with a watchful aunt could provide. That opportunity came during a house party at Lord Pembroke's country estate in early September. The cream of London society had removed to the countryside for the shooting season, and Josephine found herself included in an invitation that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The Duchess of Granville actually spoke to me at dinner. She marvelled to Kieran as they strolled through the rose garden after breakfast, Eliza and Lord Halford providing nominal chaperonage several paces behind. Last season she pretended I was invisible whenever we occupied the same room. Amazing how perception changes when a duke shows interest, Kieran observed dryly. Though I suspect she would find you quite fascinating on your own merits if she bothered to converse with you properly. You're biased, Josephine laughed. Entirely, he agreed without shame. Though not without reason. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments, the September sunshine warming the air despite the early hour. Ahead, the path divided around a small ornamental pond where stone benches offered views of water lilies and darting goldfish. Shall we rest a moment? Kieran suggested, gesturing to the nearest bench. Josephine nodded, arranging her skirts as she sat. Behind them, she noted Eliza diplomatically guiding Lord Halford toward a different path, giving them privacy while remaining within sight, the perfect balance of propriety and discretion. I've been thinking, Kieran began once they were settled, about Vienna. Vienna, Josephine echoed, surprised by the seemingly random topic. Yes, specifically about returning there. He turned slightly to face her more directly. The Foreign Office has approached me about a diplomatic mission this winter. Nothing prolonged, 3 months at most, but important to Anglo-Austrian relations. Oh, Josephine fought to hide her disappointment. After months of daily visits and constant companionship, the thought of Kieran leaving for 3 months felt like a physical blow. When would you depart? November, most likely, he replied, watching her reaction carefully. Though I've yet to give them my answer. Surely you must accept, Josephine said automatically. Your diplomatic experience is invaluable. They wouldn't ask if they didn't truly need you. Kieran smiled slightly. Always putting duty first. It's one of the many things I admire about you. Besides, she continued, trying to sound practical rather than bereft, 3 months will pass quickly. We can correspond, and by the time you return, the new season will be beginning. An excellent plan, he agreed, with one significant flaw. What's that? I have no intention of leaving you behind. His eyes held hers intently. Which brings me to the true purpose of this conversation. Josephine's heart began to pound as Kieran took her hand in both of his expression growing serious. Josephine Kensington, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You've challenged my thinking, brightened my days, and shown me what true partnership could be. His voice deepened with emotion. I came back to England seeking a duchess, but found something far more precious, a woman of character and courage who sees me as a man, not merely a title. Tears pricked Josephine's eyes as she realized what was happening. Kieran, I love you, he continued simply. Not despite your past or because of it, but for who you are in this moment and all the moments to come. I would be honored beyond words if you would consent to be my wife, my duchess, and my companion through whatever life brings us. From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds. This belonged to my grandmother, who married for love against her family's wishes and never regretted it for a day. I can think of no worthier successor. Josephine stared at the beautiful ring, then up at Kieran's face, beloved now, every line and plain familiar to her heart. 3 years ago, she had stood in a church waiting for a man who never appeared, her white gown a shroud for dead hopes. Now she sat in a sunlit garden with a man whose steadfast love had restored not just her faith in others, but in herself. Yes, she whispered, then more strongly, yes, Kieran, I will marry you. Joy transformed his features as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the sapphire glowing in the morning light like a promise made tangible. I should warn you, he said, raising her hand to his lips, that being a diplomat's wife involves travel, unusual customs, and occasionally difficult situations. How fortunate that you've chosen someone practiced in navigating society's complexities, Josephine replied with a smile. Though I confess, Returning to Vienna as your Duchess rather than a schoolgirl will be quite the transformation. The first of many adventures we'll share, Kieran promised, his eyes warm with love. Beginning with informing your aunt that her forgotten lady will soon be a duchess. Josephine laughed, a sound of pure happiness that drew smiles from Eliza and Lord Halford, who had discreetly maintained their distance but correctly interpreted the scene unfolding by the pond. As they rose to share their news, Josephine paused to look at Kieran, this man who had seen her worth when she herself had forgotten it. You once said you recognized something in me that called to you, she recalled. What was it, truly? Kieran considered the question seriously. Resilience, he answered finally, the quiet strength of someone who has been broken but refused to stay shattered. It matched something in me, something that understood that real love isn't found in perfect circumstances, but built in the spaces where we've been tested and survived. The truth of his words resonated deeply within Josephine. She had spent 3 years believing love was a privilege reserved for the unblemished and fortunate. Now she understood it was something quite different, not a reward for perfection, but a connection forged through honesty and mutual recognition of each other's true worth. I love you, she said simply, the words no less powerful for being unadorned. And I you, Kieran replied, offering his arm. More than words can express. Together they walked back toward the house, where their announcement would soon transform the forgotten lady of London's whispers into the future Duchess of Zennor, not through the machinations of fate or society, but through the enduring power of two hearts that recognized each other's value beyond all external judgment. For Josephine Kensington, once abandoned and forgotten, it was not the title or status that mattered, but the profound truth that she had been seen, known, and chosen for exactly who she was, past, present, and the brilliant future that now stretched before them like an unwritten story, waiting to be lived.